one of the specific things that you guys do is a firearms program, a firearms reporting program that we've created together, I guess, but that I run the training side of it. But the goal is to teach the basics of reporting on firearms, try and keep the students away from some of the most common mistakes you see in major media when it comes to firearms reporting, and also give them actual real world experience with gun safety training and using a firearm in person. So tell me a little bit about your decision-making process on why you agreed to do this sort of program with me, why you thought it was a good idea, what it brings to the program in your mind.
Yeah. So like you were saying, probably the big thing that we do on top of the sort of hands-on training that I do as an instructor and my colleague, Emily Jashinsky, that we do as instructors is we do, like you're saying, in-person work placement. Mm-hmm. We actually put our interns in an actual, brick and mortar newsroom around the DC area. Free Beacon being one. Reload, you had one of our interns last summer, although technically that wasn't a brick and mortar, but you get the point. Yeah. And so one of the first things I did when I came on to NJC in 2022 is, having covered media and done a lot of as a straight news media reporter, and then later as a commentator doing media criticism, I came across the same sort of mistakes and the same sort of like almost trends. Like if it's a story about a certain topic, you can almost be guaranteed that there's going to be something wrong in it. So I kind of, as a bit of a joke, says there are three big things that you can almost set your watch to in terms of whether or not if they try to report on it, they will get it wrong. Firearms, faith, and abortion. Those are, in my mind, the three main areas that no matter where you're reading, whether it's the New York Times or USA Today, chances are they're probably going to get the basics of it wrong, because it happens to be, and we can talk about this for hours, but a lot of reporters at sort of corporate, legacy, mainstream, whatever word you prefer to use, a lot of reporters at some of these larger newsrooms simply just don't know a lot about certain topics, one and three being the ones that I listed. And so when I came into NJC, one of the first things I wanted to do was incorporate a sort of firearm literacy course where we could try to avoid some of the basic, very common mistakes that we see again and again. And Stephen, I know you can speak to this. One of the things I've tried to avoid in my criticism or writing is that you don't want to just nitpick and be like, they said clip when they meant magazine. Like, that's not the point. Right. The thing where it starts to get frustrating is that you can point these things out 100 times and the editors refuse to learn and refuse to get it right because you see the same problem over and over and over again. So one of the things that when we were putting this together, wanted to do was not just sort of beat into their heads this sort of technical language in terms of firearms, but to help them contextualize a lot about firearms, especially the AR-15. So if ever they're going to have to write about gun-related violence or Second Amendment legislation, you're not completely out of your element trying to write about, I don't even know what an AR is. I don't know what an AR looks like, let alone I don't know anything about a bump stock. And yet your editor is asking you to write about some of this stuff. So in terms of, we try to give them just basic literacy, like, hey, here's the difference between fully automatic and semi-automatic. And by the way, you cannot get fully automatic legally in this country, like very basic stuff. And then after that, we actually take them to a range. It's 100% voluntary, of course. If people are uncomfortable, we never insist upon it. Then we take them to a range where they can actually fire a firearm. And many of these students fire it for the first time in their lives. They've never even touched a gun, let alone fired one. And so it's funny too, because we get a lot of international students. Yeah. Like last spring, we had a gentleman from China and a gentleman from Italy, never have touched a gun in their life. And the Italian he had a lot of fun. But he had this moment, he was like, I get it. I understand, like, sports shooting now makes sense to me. This is fun, So the idea isn't just, trying to convert them and make people huge Second Amendment fans or huge gun nuts. The idea is, if you're going to write about an AR, maybe it'd be useful if at some point you've held one, you've heard one, you can now kind of contextualize in your head what people are talking about when they talk about, say, shooting sprees, shooting events, et cetera, or the legislation, the technicalities of the AR. And I kind of used this analogy before in the past, but imagine like being a reporter and you now are going to have to cover a basketball game. You can have someone describe to you how a basketball game works, but it might be useful at some point for you to sit down and actually watch a basketball game. So that's kind of the approach that we have taken.
Or playing it, right?
Or even playing it, right? Yeah. At the very least, you can watch it, just something, try to familiarize yourself. And so that's what we've been trying to do. This is just one of those blocks of like, here's an area where media frequently gets it wrong. Let's try to correct that one young aspiring journalist at a time.
Yeah. And I think that captures the core of what we're trying to do in these classes. And we just had one last Friday, as I mentioned on the podcast I was going to go do this, and so I figured it'd be a good time to get it. We've been doing this for a little while now, and I know it interests a lot of people who subscribe to Reload, and so I want to get people a little bit deeper insight into how this works and why we're doing it. And I think you captured the real core of what I think is most important in these range trips, and the classroom portion is like, it's not so much about teaching terminology, although that's part of it.
Yeah.
Right. Obviously, we want to make sure they understand the difference between semi-automatic and fully automatic, and try to get some of these very common mistakes that you see repeated over and over again. Try to explain the different sticking points in a lot of our current gun issues that people are going to run into if they're covering this topic for a newspaper somewhere. Things like how the background check system actually works, what people mean by the gun show loophole, what that actually means, and the critiques of it, and so on and so forth. Like, trying to give them a better grasp on some of these basic things they're likely to come across, assault weapons versus assault rifle, or what the definition of an assault weapon is, and how that varies from state to state. And, a lot of these things that you will hear come up very frequently if you're writing about guns. And I do think that one of the big problems, and I think we'll get into this a little bit later on sort of when we talk about media generally, but one of the big problems is that you get a lot of general interest reporters who report on guns because not a lot of outlets actually have a beat reporter that focuses on this topic. And that leads to most of these kinds of problems, because the reporters not only have never had training like this, like what you guys are providing at NJC and what I'm helping you with, but also I've never spent much time writing about the issue before. Like, it's
Right.
something that gets worked out through beat reporting. Like, you usually become more knowledgeable about a subject the more you write about it. But if you don't have, the industry doesn't have a focus on this topic as a serious, most of the industry doesn't have a focus on this topic as like a serious subject that they want to dedicate resources to. And so, that becomes a big problem. But one way to combat that, I think the primary way to combat these things is through teaching information,
Right.
providing them information, and providing it on a more holistic level than just AR doesn't stand for assault rifle, or magazines, clips are different from magazines, or, that sort of thing that, like you said, it's easy to point out as almost a gotcha thing. Like, yes, reporters should know that if they're writing about something, but also it's not the biggest.
Right.
It's more important that they understand the fundamental issues at play.
And it's crazy to me that more, like you're saying, more newsrooms don't dedicate at least some resources to getting their reporters generally versed in this. Because that's the thing, like I was saying, like when we do range day, I don't expect them to come away loving it and being big Second Amendment nuts. Or I don't care. I just want them to know what they're talking about when they write about it. That's all I'm asking. And the fact that we had to design and sort of invent something like this because nothing like this exists and like the reason it's crazy to me is how often the firearms, the Second Amendment, the stuff is in the news. It's every 4 years, especially for presidential elections, hot topic issue. And yet newsrooms spend the bare minimum, if even that, training the reporters to understand what they're writing about, even though they're going to write about this stuff all the time.
Yeah.
And it's to me, it's crazy. It's a blind spot that makes you wonder, at what point is it willful or is it just plain laziness? And the reason being, it's there, it exists. So that's why one of the first things I did when I came on to NJC here, it was like, call you up and let's talk about how when we have these classes come through. And so just real quick, we have 2 sessions per year, one in the spring and summer. Every year we have 2 sessions come through. Sometimes classes are, there's 10 students, sometimes there's 30 students. But the idea is every fresh one comes in, they have to have some basic literacy in this issue they will almost certainly write about at some point in their careers.